April 1945. A subcamp medical facility near Dachau, Germany. Sick metal bathtubs sit inside a sterile room, filled to the brim with ice water. On a heavy wooden desk nearby rest 6 clipboards, holding pages of meticulous, handwritten records. Each document tracks water temperature, immersion times, and the steady drop of human core temperatures measured at regular intervals until the heart finally stops. Hundreds of these files fill the cabinet, spanning 2 full years of daily operations. The subjects have no names, only numbers. Their ages range from 19 to 52. Every single sheet concludes with the exact same cause of death. It is clinical, organized, and perfectly preserved. A young American soldier stares at the water, holding a frozen clipboard in his hand. He does not know it yet, but General George S. Patton will soon read these exact pages, and his response will turn this entire facility into the evidence no order could erase. This is the story of what Patton found in a room with 6 ice baths and clipboards, timing how long men took to die. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. Private First Class Luis Morales was 19 years old. He came from San Antonio, Texas, serving as a rifleman in an American infantry division, pushing deep into the German heartland. Morales grew up in a working-class neighborhood, working under the hot Texas sun before enlisting right after his 18th birthday to support his family. He had already seen his share of heavy combat across Europe, losing his childhood best friend to an artillery barrage during the winter fighting in the Ardennes. That loss left him quiet, watchful, and intensely protective of the men around him. When his squad cleared the perimeter of the facility, he was the first man to step through the heavy wooden door. In stark contrast stood Dr. Wilhelm Fassbender. He was 45 years old, a highly trained SS physician raised in Frankfurt, Germany. Fassbender viewed himself as a pioneer of modern scientific progress, completely dedicated to the ideology of state supremacy and biological purity. He believed that the lives of camp inmates were entirely expendable, famously stating in his reports that individual human survival was meaningless compared to the advancement of German military science. He enjoyed an unearned lifestyle of immense privilege, wearing a pristine, tailored uniform with highly polished leather boots, and keeping an immaculate, well-heated office filled with fine crystal glassware and expensive imported tobacco. He was a man who used a medical degree to mask systematic murder, anchoring his entire career to the suffering inside the cold room. What Patton found in a room with 6 ice baths and clipboards timing how long men took to die. April 1945. A subcamp medical facility near Dachau, Germany. Mud lines the narrow paths between timber barracks, and the gray spring sky holds a heavy, silent chill. Inside a concrete room, 6 metal bathtubs sit in a neat row, under harsh electric lights, each one filled to the brim with slush and ice water. Resting beside every tub is a wooden clipboard holding thick stacks of white paper covered in neat, ink-written rows of numbers. These papers track water temperature, immersion times, and the steady drop of human body heat until the very second a heart stops beating. A young American soldier stands by the door, staring at the numbers, realizing that someone sat here with a watch to record the exact duration of a human life freezing to death. General George S. Patton will soon see these clipboards, and his response will turn this clinical laboratory into a sealed trap for the man who signed the records. The young lieutenant from the medical corps walked slowly down the row of white enamel basins, his boots clicking sharply on the damp concrete floor. He kept his eyes fixed on the man standing across from him, who wore a spotless white laboratory coat over a tailored gray wool uniform. The doctor's hands were folded neatly behind his back, his fingers resting near a heavy gold signet ring on his right hand. The lieutenant pulled a notebook from his pocket and held up a pencil, trying to keep his voice completely flat and objective as he started his inquiry. He asked why these specific records were separated from the main camp administration files, and why they contained no patient names. The doctor did not move. He tilted his head slightly, looking down at the young officer with a calm, untroubled expression. He said the papers were not public administrative records, but rather highly specialized scientific data gathered for the development of emergency protocols. He stated that the lack of names was standard procedure for experimental groups, as the individual identities were entirely irrelevant to the statistical curves of thermal decline. He spoke with the slow, deliberate patience of a university professor, explaining a basic laboratory concept to a dull student. The lieutenant looked back down at the clipboard in his left hand, reading the entry for Subject 42. He pointed to the final notation, which indicated a core temperature that could not sustain human life, followed by a recorded duration of 45 minutes. He asked why the immersion continued long after the subject had lost consciousness and entered total physiological failure. He asked what possible medical purpose could be served by watching a man freeze to death after the data on initial thermal shock had already been collected. The doctor smiled faintly, adjusting the collar of his pristine coat. He said that a proper scientific study requires complete observations until the terminal endpoint is reached, or else the data remains fragmented and useless to the state. He stated that German aviation pilots were currently falling into the freezing waters of the North Sea, and his work was designed to save them by understanding the exact mechanics of the ultimate threshold. He said, ordinary prisoners were plentiful, but genuine scientific breakthroughs were rare and required absolute discipline to achieve. The lieutenant closed his notebook with a sharp snap that echoed off the cold concrete walls. He informed the doctor that the United States Army did not recognize clinical murder as a legitimate branch of aviation medicine, and that the entire facility was now under military guard. He told the man to remain exactly where he was and to touch nothing in the laboratory until superior officers arrived. The doctor simply turned away, walking back toward his desk to arrange his fountain pens in a neat parallel line. He muttered that a common infantry soldier could never comprehend the grand necessity of high-level research. The report detailing the 6 ice baths and the specific contents of the clipboards reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence across the muddy yard was absolute. The general walked in unannounced. He did not look at the walls, or the guards, or the gray sky. He walked straight through the heavy timber door of the medical facility, his boots striking the concrete with a slow, rhythmic snap. Every man in the room froze. The American guards stood at rigid attention. The German doctor, standing by his neat desk, slowly lowered his hands to his sides. Patton stopped exactly 3 feet from the first metal bathtub. He looked at the slush. He looked at the clipboards. His face was entirely devoid of color, his eyes fixed on the neat rows of clinical ink. He did not raise his voice. His tone was low, thin, and freezing. He asked who wrote the numbers on the page. The doctor cleared his throat, adjusting his spotless white coat, and stated that the records were his own. Patton asked if the men in the water were military volunteers. The doctor replied that they were state prisoners assigned to necessary survival research. Patton asked how many minutes it took for the heart to stop in the final test. The doctor said the average duration was 84 minutes until complete cardiac arrest. Patton studied him. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. He said that a man who spends 20 years studying medicine does so to preserve human life. Yet here stood a physician who used a stopwatch to measure the exact speed of murder. He acknowledged that the doctor considered this work a grand contribution to aviation science, a necessary sacrifice for the survival of pilots in the North Sea. But the reality was far simpler. It was not science. It was merely slaughter committed by a coward hiding behind a medical degree and a clean apron. He looked toward the adjacent room where the 3 emaciated survivors lay wrapped in the field jacket of a 19-year-old American private from Texas. He said that a real soldier faces his enemy in the mud with a rifle, while a monster straps helpless, starving men into tubs of ice water and waits for their blood to turn to slush. He told the doctor that his immaculate white coat was a fraud, and his precise academic notes were nothing more than a written confession signed by his own hand. He gave the doctor a binary choice. He said the facility was now a forensic crime scene, and every scrap of paper would be used to hang him at a military tribunal. He told the man he could either walk out of the room in handcuffs to face the gallows, or he could experience the exact physical reality of the scientific data he had spent 2 years collecting. The doctor stared at the 4 stars on Patton's helmet, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. The choice was never a real debate, and the consequences arrived swiftly, without negotiation. Patton gave a sharp nod to the waiting military police, and the concrete room filled with the sudden, metallic movement of armed men. 2 American guards stepped forward, seized the doctor by his elbows, and stripped the clean white laboratory coat from his shoulders, leaving him in his gray wool uniform. They marched him directly over to the first enamel basin, where the slush and ice water still waited under the glare of the electric lights. His boots dragged across the floor as they forced him down onto his knees beside the freezing tub. The doctor looked into the dark water, his face twisted in sudden panic as the cold air off the ice hit his skin. He cried out, his voice echoing sharply off the damp walls, but the guards held his arms with a heavy, unyielding grip. They pushed his hands and forearms deep into the slush, holding them beneath the surface, while the young lieutenant stood nearby with a stopwatch, counting the passing seconds aloud. The remaining guards and the 3 emaciated survivors watched in absolute silence from the doorway. The doctor's fingers turned a deep, painful red within minutes, his body shaking violently as the cold began to deaden his nerves. He begged them to stop, but the timer kept running, forcing him to face the exact physical reality he had so meticulously recorded on his clipboards. Private First Class Luis Morales returned home to San Antonio, Texas, after his discharge from the military. He spent decades working in a small furniture repair shop, his hands constantly active to quiet the memories of that concrete room near Dachau. He never could tolerate the cold winter months, always keeping his home heated to a stifling degree, a habit his family understood, but never openly questioned. He lived a quiet, unassuming life as a dedicated father and grandfather, passing away peacefully in November 1989. Wilhelm Fassbender stood trial before an American military tribunal at Nuremberg in the summer of 1946, where the meticulous clipboards he had so carefully maintained served as the primary evidence against him. He was stripped of his medical license and sentenced to life imprisonment in Landsberg prison. His initial arrogance entirely dissolved into a bitter, broken silence. He spent his remaining years writing unread technical manuscripts from his cell, constantly complaining about the damp draft through his barred window until his death from heart failure in 1961. General George S. Patton never spoke of the subcamp medical facility in any of his public addresses or press conferences during the final months of his life. He kept a duplicate copy of the final investigative report locked securely in his personal desk drawer, alongside his ivory-handled revolvers. In a private diary entry dated late April, he noted that the true horror of the modern world was not the chaos of the battlefield, but the absolute coldness of an educated mind stripped of its basic human conscience. April 1945, a subcamp medical facility near Dachau, Germany. 6 metal bathtubs sit in a row under dim incandescent bulbs. They are filled with ice water, chunks of white ice floating on the surface. Next to each tub, a wooden clipboard hangs from an iron nail on the wall. The white sheets of paper contain neat rows of numbers: water temperature, immersion time, core body temperature. Every column is filled out at precise 5-minute intervals until the final entry reads 0. A digital clock sits on a desk nearby, its ticking loud against the concrete walls. In the next room, 3 emaciated figures lie shivering under thin rags, their legs locked in permanent paralysis. A clipboard on the door tracks their survival by the second. General George S. Patton will soon stand in this room, look at the clipboards, and deliver a punishment that mirrors the exact mechanical cruelty of the men who held the watches. What Patton found in a room with 6 ice baths and clipboards timing. How long men took to die. April 1945. A medical facility in a subcamp near Dachau, Germany. Sunlight spills across a clean tile floor, catching the glint of polished metal. Everything inside the clinic looks pristine, orderly, and professional. Then comes the discovery. American soldiers push open a heavy oak door and find 6 large steel bathtubs. Each tub is packed to the brim with frozen chunks of ice and dark, freezing water. Next to every tub hangs a clean wooden clipboard. These clipboards contain hundreds of meticulous entries, tracking water temperature, exact immersion times, and the plunging core body temperature of human beings measured at regular intervals until their hearts stopped beating. General George S. Patton will soon receive the detailed report from this laboratory of death. His response will transform these clinical records into an unyielding instrument of justice that no order could ever erase.